As you saw in video 6, the coming of the white horse was connected to the festival of Triton and Apollo. In chapter 9, you saw that John identifies the coming new Roman Empire as simply a second reincarnation of the worship of these two deities, both mentioned by name in the Greek texts. And you saw in video 15, Revelation chapter 9 verse 11, was an unmistakable reference to the Greco-Roman sun deity, Apollon, known as Apollo, in Latin. When we come to Revelation chapter 10 and 11, you are going to see another amazing allusion to December 25th. And as you will soon see, it will completely expose the bogus claim. December 25th has anything to do with Christ. In fact, it is quite the opposite. When you get to chapter 10 and 11, and dig into the Greek text behind the English translation, you are going to discover why the Masons, today's Church of England, and the Vatican, can never teach the truth that is written in the book of Revelation. They simply cannot teach it, without indicting themselves. That isn't to say, they do not know it is there. In fact, they do fully know, it is there. And they know it quite well. It is only a secret from the public, they wish to hide the information from. But it is not a secret to those who are hiding it. And as you have seen earlier, there is more than ample evidence that these things are being intentionally hidden, and even censored from the public. From the translation work that intentionally hides certain words and phrases in the Greek, to the tightly controlled teachings about these texts by professional clergy who are held hostage by their paychecks. They have created a very tightly controlled, echo chamber of theological uniformity. The historical interpretation of Revelation came under institutional censorship, shortly after President Grant in the United States, largely through the work of the Masons. But in England, the historical interpretation of Revelation became the subject of censorship by the government in the time of Queen Victoria. And you will discover more about that and why. But when it comes to Revelation chapter 10, here are the things you should notice that lay open and exposed to you. Something is being hidden from you about this text. The first and perhaps most obvious strange anomaly in theological behavior about this text is that John gives an absolutely crystal clear time frame to date the beginning of events in chapter 11. It is so clear and unmistakable that no amount of IQ level, no matter how low, could account for the idiotic way it is avoided. It's very clear in the text. He states his events in chapter 11 begin 42 months after the fall of Jerusalem. And there is no way to get around it. So they simply hide it, ignore it, obscure it, and excuse it. They really don't want you looking too closely at it, because they have no real explanation for it. And that tells you they are hiding what is there. Secondly, another quite amazing anomaly of theological behavior takes place concerning the translation of chapter 10 verse 6. Anyone trained at any seminary or Bible college, with just the slightest knowledge of Koine Greek, can see what is in that text in the Greek. But the public never ever hears of it. You will never hear a preacher get up and tell you what is in that Greek text. And you will see more shocking detail about chapter 10 verse 6 in just a moment. But chapter 10 verse 6 exposes their deceptions, as much as Revelation 9 verse 11's reference to Apollo. And it will once again address God's judgment on the false god of Rome, and the Nicolaitan Antichrist, in shocking detail. And thus why it is kept hidden. And thirdly, you will see their attempts at intentional deceit illustrated by their fully intentional suppression of history surrounding this text. This text refers to some of the most momentous events in human history, but they are events which the public is virtually completely ignorant of. They are not ignorant of these events because these events are so obscure. They are ignorant of these events because that is precisely what the Counter-Reformation wishes people to be concerning them. And just as you saw how they intentionally hid the reference and history of Apollo in video 15, so too once again, you are going to see the very same pattern of hiding, suppression, censorship and denial concerning chapter 10 and 11. The same exact identical patterns of hiding and deceiving emerge once again concerning text in Revelation. And very soon, you will see why. So, it is fair and reasonable to say, when you see preachers doing these three specific things, you are listening to someone who is not explaining anything to you about these two chapters. They are actually attempting to hide what is in them. And if they personally are not doing it for that purpose, then it is certainly the ones who taught them. and the preacher you are actually listening to is either just not intelligent enough, or curious enough, to realize he has simply become another pawn in their deceit. Christ said those who worship God must worship Him in spirit and truth, so truth is not negotiable to anyone who actually follows Christ. It is a basic requirement. Before we go through Revelation chapter 10, we will look at these three issues topically. After that, we will go through the text and examine John's astronomically dated timeline for the events described in chapter 10. Then we will compare his descriptions within his astronomically dated timeline to that same period of history to see what actually happened, and if his prophecies were fulfilled, and how. As mentioned previously, the Counter-Reformation has hidden a great deal of information from the public in the book of Revelation. And once again, we run into a group of texts that have been completely mangled to prevent the public from seeing what is clearly in them, in the underlying Greek text. The first and foremost effort at hiding the content of chapter 10 and 11 actually begins in chapter 11. Why is that? Because in chapter 11 verse 2, we have a very clear fixed time frame John gives for the beginning of events, in chapter 11. Chapter 10 comes before chapter 11 because it is part of a single narrative. The rainbow angel comes first in chapter 10, to signify and announce the coming of the two witnesses in chapter 11. So chapter 10 comes before chapter 11, in the narrative. So what's the big problem? And what have they hidden? The problem is that chapter 11 verse 2, no matter how you read it, clearly contradicts the claim that all this takes place at the end of the world, or the end of time. In fact, if you do believe in Counter-Reformation Rapture theology, chapter 11 verse 2 is very clear: the rapture would have taken place before 138 AD, and the two witnesses have already come and gone thousands of years ago. And you will see why that is absolutely and unmistakably true, in just a moment. Every serious adherent of Counter-Reformation Rapture theology has seen this problem for themselves, if they are honest, when they have come to Revelation chapter 11 verse 2. There is an irreconcilable problem between the theology and the actual text, again. And this one has directly to do with the time frame. The problem is, it is very clear from the text, the two witnesses should have already come in history, no matter how you interpret the text. If you use the Counter-Reformation's own interpretation, you will end up with a date that is literally more than 1800 years ago. If you take the text completely literally, you do not have 3.5 years into a future 7-year tribulation. What you have is 3.5 years after the fall of Jerusalem, or more specifically, after it is given to the Gentiles, as the text actually says. The beginning of the time frame is clearly stated as Gentiles beginning the trampling of the city of Jerusalem. The end of the time frame is 42 months later. And there is no way to get around that statement, other than to dishonestly rewrite it, or suppress its clarity. Both of which, Counter-Reformationists will actually try to do, with that text. Jerusalem fell in 70 to 74 AD, depending on how you mark the event. But it was actually not given to the Gentiles, as John describes, until after the Romans rebuilt the city, and renamed it by the Roman name, Aelia Capitolina, when it actually was literally and intentionally given to the Gentiles precisely as John describes. In response to the Bar Kokhba Jewish rebellion, the decision was made to literally ban Jews from the city of Jerusalem, and give it to Gentiles, as a possession. And that was literally a statement made by the Roman Caesar. The text in Revelation chapter 11 verse 2 reads as follows in the King James Version, quote, "But the court which is without the temple leave out, and measure it not. For it is given unto the Gentiles, and the holy city shall they tread under foot 42 months." End quote. John is introducing this dating reference to explain when the two witnesses will come, as he states in the very next verse, quote, "And I will give power unto my two witnesses, and they shall prophesy." End quote. This is what occurs after the 42-month period. Which, if you reject Hebraic prophetic dating as done in the book of Daniel, which Counter-Reformationists must do, that means the time frame for this prophecy occurs only 3.5 years later in 134 AD. Which obviously is not the end of the world, or the end of time, or anything in the future from today. So counter-reformationists have a serious problem here, in this text. And rather than admit the problem in the text, they simply hide it. John then goes on to say, in verse 3, that he will give them power to prophesy 1260 days, after that, which ironically, is another 42 months, exactly. It is the very same exact time period, stated in days, rather than months. And there is a reason for that which is important in Hebraic time conversion, but has absolutely no point in counter-reformation literalism, which should be another concern to anyone who holds to counter-reformation rapture theology when they read that text. There is absolutely no real reason for the change in units, as some do attempt to claim. In the end, it is the same time period if you reject Hebraic time conversion. However, if you do not, it is something very different, and thus the change in time cycles. Meaning, however, that the whole thing in chapter 10 and 11 would be over by no later than 138 AD. According to the Counter-Reformation's own dating methodology. And that is a dirty little secret they never bother to tell the public. There is no gap presented in the text. The measurement of time is clearly referenced to the beginning of that period of history, and counting 42 months later. Continuously. There is no gap or break in that continuous timeline reference. And it is completely concluded within another 42 months. Let's take a moment and let that point sink in. If you demand that there be a rapture, and then the two witnesses come, you are stuck with a time frame given directly and clearly by John himself, that places the rapture sometime no later in history than 138 AD. And that is the end of the story for the rapture. 138 AD. Did you make the rapture in 138 AD, or are you still here? Of course, there was no rapture in 138 AD, so you have to admit either the rapture interpretation is just plain wrong, or John was a false prophet and missed his prophecy. It is clear here, somebody has made a huge mistake. But it would be extremely odd behavior to demand one's rapture interpretation of John's prophecy over John's actual prophecy itself, which did in fact actually occur, precisely as was prophesied, if you accept the historical interpretation of his prophecy, based on Hebraic prophetic dating. And John was, after all, a Hebrew, not a Latin counter-reformationist. But of course, if you do accept John's prophecy as Hebraic, rather than Latin, it unavoidably points to the papacy as the Antichrist. And that is why counter-reformation rapture propagandists simply refuse to read that text and stick with what it actually says. Their theology forces them to bend and twist the words and grammar of the text. Either the text prevails and the theology goes away, or the theology prevails and the text goes away. But you cannot have counter-reformation theology and Revelation 11:2 at the same time. They mutually exclude one another. They treat that particular text, like they do all the other texts in the book of Revelation, that contradict their claims, as though it were nothing more than an ink blot for free association. But the fact is, this text is far from being an ink blot. It is a very specific, very clear, timeline reference to some point in history beginning with a Gentile rule over the city of Jerusalem. And 42 months later, the two witnesses in verse 3 come. And it is as clear in the text as it can possibly be. Counter-Reformation propagandist preachers know they cannot fix this problem. So they simply hide it and lie about what the text says. Because the point of the theology is political effect, not the truth of any text in the Bible. So when you see this being done, you can know, without any hesitancy, the preacher that is hiding the problem in that text is either an intellectually challenged and spiritually compromised individual, or an intentional liar. But there is no third option to pick from. And no matter how you take the text, whether counter-reformation interpretation or even historic interpretation, according to John's own words, those two witnesses have already come. And they did so centuries ago. The two witnesses have already come and gone, a long time ago. So, that means only one of two scenarios are possible: either John missed his prophecy, or it has already happened. That is it. There is no third possibility. John himself gives the date to the year of what he was prophesying about. So in chapter 11 verse 2, you are faced with two possible ways to interpret John's time frame. One is the literalist 42 months that counter-reformationists prefer to propagate, which place the events of verse 3 no later in history than 138 AD. The other option for John's reference in verse 2 is to treat it precisely the same as all the other references previously in the book have been, which produce amazingly specific and accurate prophetic dates, based on the Hebraic model of prophetic dating. Since the book was written by a Hebrew, rather than a Roman, it is probably a better bet to interpret the book's dating scheme as Hebraic, rather than the counter-reformationist Roman. So, let's see what date the counter-reformation would actually be attempting to hide in their strangulations of Revelation chapter 11 verse 2. As mentioned earlier, the date given for the renaming of Jerusalem as Aelia Capitolina, and given to the Gentiles was 130 AD. The Counter-Reformation's method of interpretation renders the events of chapter 11 verse 3 as beginning no later than 133 or 134 AD, if you take the text as it is written, without their added embellishments and contortions. But the Hebraic method of dating prophecy, also known as the historic interpretation, after the example of Daniel's prophecy concerning the coming of Christ, takes 42 months, which is 1260 days, as 1260 years. Following the year for a day principle, recognized by all the reformers during the Reformation. If you follow the historic interpretation, and count the time from when Jerusalem was renamed Aelia Capitolina, in the year 130 AD, and add 1260 years to it, that brings you to the year 1390 AD. Meaning Revelation chapter 11 verse 3 begins historically in 1390 AD. Which also means, chapter 10 begins sometime before the fixed date of 1390 AD. So, if you are going to be an honest person about this text, you only have one of two options. The first is the counter-reformationist date of 134 AD and the coming of the two witnesses, or the Hebraic historic date of 1390 AD, which is over 1,000 years later. But either way, those are two dates that are both in the past by several centuries, in either case. And those are your only two honest options. 134 AD or 1390 AD. And the two witnesses come. There is nothing else to pick from given that text. Here is what is so significant about John's time frame, which he establishes verbatim, openly, and in his own words. There are very clearly only two options available, given the text. Only two. And both options conclusively eliminate counter-reformation theology as a valid explanation for the book of Revelation. The futurist view, which attempts to put everything in the future, is eliminated because the date calculated by their own methodology for this text is 138 AD, which is not future at all. It is centuries, and even millennia, in history past. And this fact also eliminates preterism, which attempts to put everything in the past around the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, because John clearly cites the giving of Jerusalem to the Gentiles, which factually occurred in 130 AD. Placing John's time frame in Revelation chapter 11 verse 2, several decades after the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, and well into John's future. In fact, there is only one school of interpretation that can account for John's time frame of 42 months after 130 AD, and that is the historic interpretation. That is the only one that fits. Neither of the other two models can remain consistent with John's time frame in Revelation chapter 11 verse 2. And as you saw in the previous video, John has just finished prophesying the Mongolian invasion from the east, from across the Euphrates River, and this occurred in 1220 AD. The Hebraic prophetic date of 1390 AD for the seventh trumpet fits exactly at the point in history that the sixth trumpet just finished accurately describing to the year. The historic method is the only interpretation that can account for Revelation chapter 11 verse 2. Not the futurist interpretation, nor the preterist interpretation. Only the historical interpretation accurately explains John's time frame in Revelation chapter 11 verse 2. And as you will soon see, it explains a whole lot more as well. In fact, way too much, according to the Counter-Reformation, who has been incessantly inventing ways to hide it for centuries. And so the question now becomes, why would you hide the events of 1390 AD behind a phony and falsified interpretation, which actually forces you into a rapture that must occur before 138 AD, which you then also have to lie about? If you are a counter-reformationist, what is so dangerous, what is so damning, what is so embarrassing about the year 1390 AD? That is what you are about to find out in a moment. But next, we are going to look at what they are hiding in the Greek text, in chapter 10 verse 6. And something very amazing will begin to emerge from the shadows of the Counter-Reformation and its efforts of censorship and denial. Not only do Counter-Reformation preachers hide the timeline for the beginning of events in chapter 11, which also places chapter 10 somewhere before it. There are 5 points of significant content that are being hidden in chapter 10, in order to completely distort and hide what is in the chapter. Just as you saw with all the previous chapters in Revelation, and especially with chapter 9, so will these tricks and gimmicks continue to be played into chapter 10. The 5 points of content hiding in chapter 10 involve the following 5 topics. 1. The phrase, the little book, mentioned 4 times in verses 2, 8, 9 and 10. 2. The phrase, time no more, mentioned in verse 6. 3. 7 thunders, mentioned in verse 3 and 4. 4. The rainbow angel, mentioned in verses 1, 5, 7 and 10. 5. The timeline, mentioned in chapter 11 verse 2 and its associated time conversion in chapter 10 verses 3, 4 and 7. The Counter-Reformation suppresses these 5 points of content, to essentially get from this chapter all the things they need to support their theology, none of which however is actually present, once you dig into the text and compare their explanations of it, with what is actually there. And we will look at these 5 points of suppressed content, beginning with point 1, the phrase, the little book, mentioned in verses 2, 8, 9 and 10. As just noted, the phrase, the little book, is mentioned 4 times in verses 2, 8, 9 and 10. Along with the prophecy about the 7 thunders, the prophecy about the coming of the book, constitute the 2 main prophecies of Revelation chapter 10. Ask a Counter-Reformation preacher to draw you a picture of a library, and wait to see if he draws a picture of a tiny little book. If he doesn't, then you can know he has been complicit in hiding the meaning of the text in Revelation 10, in the phrase, a little book, which he will obviously not draw when you ask him to draw a picture of a library. And you will see why, in a moment. Since half of the chapter of Revelation chapter 10, involves the prophecy of what is translated as, a little book, into our English translations, there is really no way this prophecy can possibly be understood, unless you first understand what John meant by the phrase that is translated into English as, a little book. The English word, little, clearly implies physical size. And that is relative to what is defined as the average size for that particular thing, and in contrast, what is defined as big, for that particular thing. A big dog might be an Irish hound, and a little dog might be a Chihuahua. A big book might be a single-volume encyclopedia, and a little book would be something along the size of a memento book filled with a few poems you might buy as a gift, which could be kept in a purse, from the bookstore. And so based on these modern English size differences, people read the English phrase, a little book, and picture a miniature book. And if John had been speaking modern English, and had actually said that, then that is precisely what the text would mean. But unfortunately, John didn't speak modern English. He spoke Koine Greek. And to make matters more suspicious, what we have in the Greek text, is not Koine Greek for, a little book. To say the phrase, little book, that expression uses 2 Greek words. One word for little, which is micro, from which we get our English word, micro, as in microscope and microchip, and the second word is biblio, which we get our word, Bible. So the way to say, little book, in Greek, is to say microbiblio, which means literally, little book. But instead of finding those 2 words, microbiblio, in the Greek text, we find in the Greek text, a single word. And it is the word, bibliaridion. It is made up of the word, biblio, plus the suffix, aridion. So what exactly does that mean? if you look up this term in the standard Greek lexicon, for example like Strong's or Thayer's, you will find another very odd anachronism used as a definition for this Greek word. You will be told it means a booklet, therefore indicating it is little or small. Therefore the translation, little book. So you see in that explanation, a three-step process of assumption. In the explanation, you assume it means booklet, then you assume a booklet is smaller physically than a book, then you assume, therefore it means, little book. And while in our modern English language a booklet is defined as having fewer pages in it than a book, the physical size or dimensions of a booklet can be much larger in breadth and width than a book. A book can be small, and a booklet can be huge, so even in our modern English, there is no set physical limitations on the actual size, meaning physical dimensions, of either. A booklet can be much bigger physically, in terms of its dimensions, than a book. In defense of that explanation they will point out that John ate the book, so obviously it couldn't have been big. But eating a book doesn't demand that it be little, either. And considering his language is symbolic, that is a pretty weak argument. In reality, the book could have been little, only because the angel that brought it was giant. If it had one leg on land and another on the sea, it was obviously of a colossal size, meaning any book at all, in his hand, would have been little by comparison. And further, as part of the same narrative in chapter 11 verse 1, after eating the book, he is given a measuring reed, which comes from eating the book. A measuring reed, in John's day, was 8 to 10 feet long, depending on which type he was making his reference. A literal tiny little book wouldn't produce an 8 to 10 foot measuring stick. It's simply not proportional. So there are some problems with that explanation, even given if things are precisely as they are explained. But they are not. And here's the problem. Our modern word booklet is defined by very well specified parameters that are actually legal definitions used by the US Post Office to charge shipping rates. It is quite certain John did not refer to that. When you look into the etymology of the English word, booklet, you will discover it was not used until the 1850s. So you can be sure that John, speaking ancient Koine Greek, did not refer to that English term from the 1850s. But what about the concept of a booklet itself? Nope. That is amiss as well. Booklets hadn't even been invented yet at the time of John's writing. They didn't make booklets back then, so he obviously could not have been referring to one. And if he had meant little book, he would have said so in Greek by stating the phrase microbiblio, or any one of its innumerable grammatical variants. But he didn't. And we have seen this very same problem in English translation when we looked at the phrase, breastplates of iron, which actually referred to Roman lorica segmentata, and was defined anachronistically by Strong's lexicon as a corselet, which didn't even exist in John's time. Here once again, we have as a definition of a word in Greek, both as a term and as a thing, which did not exist in John's time, and to which he could not have been referring to in his language. And unfortunately, this kind of anachronistic definition occurs a lot in some of our standard Greek lexicons. So in order to really understand what John was saying in chapter 10, we are going to have to do some detective work on this term. Because they are not telling us the truth about this term, nor what it actually meant to John. The first part of the term, Biblia, is used 3 times in the New Testament. John 21:25, 2 Timothy 4:13, Revelation 20:12. And it is used 3 times in the Greek translation of the Old Testament known as a Septuagint. In 2 Kings 19:14, 20:12, and Ecclesiastes 12:12. For a total of 6 times in the Bible. In Ecclesiastes chapter 12 verse 12, it is translated as book. In 2 Kings chapter 20 verse 12 and chapter 19 verse 14, the term is translated as letters. In John 12:25 it is translated as books. In 2 Timothy 4:13, it is translated as books, and distinguished from parchments. In Revelation 10:12, it is translated as books as well. But we have another problem in our English translation with this root word, Biblia. It didn't mean book, either. They didn't have books, they had tablets, which were single sheets made from clay or metal. They had scrolls, which were rolled up on 2 sets of sticks. or they had parchments, which were loose single sheets, made out of either papyri or animal skins. They did not have books, or booklets. So even in the root word, Biblia, we have a very sloppy translation of what they were talking about. There are big differences between letters, tablets, parchments and scrolls. And none of them are books, or booklets. The primary meaning of Biblia is a roll, as was done on 2 sticks or a scroll. It doesn't mean book. So it obviously couldn't have been a reference to a little book, as the root term doesn't even mean a book. So John was making a reference to a scroll when he used the term Biblia. That is somewhat minor, in the sense that we do associate books with scrolls, as most of the things which once existed on scrolls were later transferred into books. But it is an important minor distinction we have to keep in mind when translating ancient texts into modern speech. Because books are different things from scrolls. Even if the modern equation seems appropriate most of the time. If you were a treasure hunter and told to look for a book, when really it was a scroll, you would end up finding the wrong thing. So the difference should be noted here. And he was modifying his reference to the word scroll with the Greek suffix aridion. And this is where they erroneously get the idea of little. Variants of that suffix are used to mean what seems to be little in other Greek words. For example, the Greek word for a young child is paidion, and it uses a variant of that suffix. But young is not the same as little, even though most are, compared to adults. It was just the word that was used to distinguish a young child from an older one. It could just as easily meant young or new, rather than physically little. So what does this suffix, aridion, that John used on his term, Biblia, to refer to something else, other than a scroll, actually mean? The first thing any good student of the scriptures has to do is see how the term is used by biblical authors. The only problem we run into here is that when you do a search on that term in the rest of scripture, you are going to discover no one else in the entire Bible, not in the Old Testament Septuagint, or in the Greek New Testament, ever uses that term. John's use of that term is absolutely unique in the Bible. So there must be a reason why. So what did he mean and why is he the only one who uses that term? If you type the suffix aridion into Google Translate, you will discover that the English translation for it is the English suffix, ary, such as is used in the words, seminary, or mortuary, or library. The English word library, which actually uses that suffix, is also made up of 2 words. The first is libra, which was Latin for the word scroll, which we equate to book, with the suffix, ary, ry. So ask yourself the question, does the word library mean little book? If our English translation of Revelation chapter 10 is correct, then we should be thinking, a library is a little book. Because you have the very same 2 words present in the English word library, as you do, Biblia aridion. It is actually the same 2 words. One from Greek, and the other from Latin, Biblia ary, and libra ary, actually mean the same exact things, semantically. Yet, no one thinks of a little book when they hear the word library. So neither should you think John meant little book when he used the term Biblia aridion. Even if what he is describing seems to be little in the text, the suffix he is using does not mean little. So what was John talking about when he used the term Biblia aridion? He obviously didn't mean a whole library. If you look up the definition for the term ary from the Greek word aridion, you will find it is pretty generic. It just means anything having to do with a particular thing. There is no reference to size in the term. It is simply a generic suffix. It means a place or thing having to do with a certain thing. The book of Revelation is the last composition in the New Testament. The composition date places it around 96 AD. And here is what is interesting about that date, and John's use of this term. It coincides with something that was happening in the way writings were being collected and preserved. At the same time, John uses this new term. And that explains why the term is used nowhere else in the New Testament, until John. And what it was not a little book. It was a bibliary, or Biblia aridion, as John calls it. A library is a place where multiple books or scrolls are stored. And a bibliary or Biblia aridion was something very similar. It was a single volume, in which multiple books or scrolls were stored. But it wasn't a box. It was the earliest versions of what we have today as bound books. Not a booklet or a little book, but a codice. If you had a collection of writings and you wanted to carry them around, or store them together, there was no way to do that in the old way of parchments and scrolls. Scrolls were bulky and parchments had to be carried around in sacks. So around the end of the 1st century, people in the ancient world began to collect their writings together by punching holes through individual sheets of papyri or vellum, and tying them together into a single volume. These were called bibliaridians. And this is what a bibliaridian actually looked like. As you can see, bibliaridians are not necessarily little. They are little in the sense they take up much less space than a bunch of scrolls and parchments. But a bibliaridian was not a little book. It was the earliest beginnings of a book, proper, that was much smaller by comparison to a sack of scrolls and parchments. And that is what the phrase, little book, actually means in John's Greek text, in Revelation chapter 10. It does not mean a little book. When you look at your own Bible today, you're looking at precisely what John would have called a bibliaridian. In fact, he did. Was it smaller than a scroll? Of course. Was it a tiny little miniature book as counter-reformationists always show? Absolutely not. And you will see even more proof about that fact later. But the explanation that, because John uses the term bibliaridian, it therefore does not refer to the Bible, is actually a case in language that argues for precisely the opposite, because the term bibliaridiani does not mean little book any more than the term library would mean the same. Neither term means little book. And someone has been putting words into John's mouth in order to get him to write things. In reality, he made no reference to historically. The reason counter-reformationists hide this terminology is because you can't get the text to refer to the end of the world if you admit this text refers to something that was happening in history. Which it does. As evidenced by the very word they hide under the phrase, little book. The English word, time, occurs in 164 verses for a total of 171 times in the King James Bible. But there is more than one word that is translated as time into English. In fact, there are 21 different words in Greek translated as the English word, time. 21 different words. So there were a lot of different ways to refer to time in the Greek language. But those 21 different words actually occur 1,246 times. And out of 1,246 times, only 171 times are these words translated as the word, time. So there were a lot of other ways these words were used in Greek. Only 13% of their uses were translated into the English word, time. Only 13%. So they could be used to refer to a lot of other things. And often, the only way it is decided by translators to translate those terms into English as the word, time, is simply by the way they are used in the context of the sentence or paragraph. And that is pretty much it. It is a subjective judgment call by the translators. And they render those terms, as the English word time, only 13% of the time when they are used. Only 13% of their usage. When we get to chapter 10 verse 6, there is an anomaly in the translation of this text, and it revolves around how it is translated. The text says, quote, "And the angel which I saw stand upon the sea and upon the earth, lifted up his hand to heaven, and swore by him that liveth forever and ever, who created heaven and the things that therein are, and the earth and the things that therein are, and the sea and the things which are therein, that there should be time no longer." End quote. The last part of that verse reads, quote, "There should be time no longer." End quote. The text is very clear in English. The angel in chapter 10 declares time should come to an end. That is what it says in English, and it is very clear that is what the English text actually means. Time should be no more. Time ought not to be. When preachers get to that verse, they know they have several problems. The first of which is that time doesn't end. Chapter 10 is only halfway through the book, and there are many more things to come, in time, complete with time frames. The very next chapter itself gives several time frames for events, So obviously time doesn't end. Nor should it come to an end. But, that is precisely what the text says, when translated into English. Time should be no more. So preachers try to fix this problem. They look at that text, scratch their heads, and decide what else it could mean, other than what it says. And the best way out of this problem is to claim it means, there is no more delay. It seems to make sense, since in the very next verse he mentions that in the days of the seventh angel, the mystery of God shall be finished. So that rendering flows into the next text very well, and makes very good sense. Problem solved. There is no more delay of time. In fact, some modern translations go even farther and try to fix the problem for the reader by simply rewriting the text in English as reading, "There is no more delay," or some variation of that statement. Problem solved. And despite the courtesy from those modern translators, putting those words in John's mouth for us, so we don't have to dig into the Greek text, something is being glossed over and hidden from the reader in doing that. There is only one small problem with all these nice and very neat fixes for this text. And that is not what the text actually and literally says. It says precisely what you read in that very awkward literal rendering into English: time should be no more. In fact, there is a specific word for delay that is used in the Greek New Testament. It is the Greek word okanino, and literally means delay. It is used in Acts 9:38 and Acts 25:17, and in both places it is translated as the word delay. But that word is explicitly not used in Revelation 10 verse 6. It is not used there, because that is not what John meant to say. So what's going on here? What is causing the very awkward translation of that text into a sentence in English that makes absolutely no sense? That you have to literally rewrite for John, in order to get it to make any logical sense whatsoever? And what is being glossed over here, in the Greek text, in these cheap and easy fixes? It is none other than one of these 21 words, that is translated into the English word, time. And here is what is fascinating about that term. It is used 53 times in the New Testament. It is a normal use, to refer to time in Greek. In fact, there is nothing wrong with the bad translation. That is precisely how it should have been translated, if you were going to translate it. And obviously if you are translating, that is what you have to do. So why does it end up creating an impossible sentence in English, when you do? What is going on with this text? The answer to this anomaly is found in the fact that some things do not translate from one language to another. You might be able to render a word from one language straight into another. But sometimes you miss or lose a nuance of meaning, or an undertone in the expression itself that simply does not carry over when it is translated. You saw this previously with the Greek word triton, which does literally mean a third part or three parts. But it was also the name of the Greco-Roman deity Triton, who was a father of arranging gods of Rome into triads. And that reference was completely lost when you simply translated that word into English. In chapter 10 verse 6, we have another example of that happening. The word translated as the English word time, in chapter 10 verse 6, does in fact mean time. There is nothing wrong with that translation. But if you didn't translate the phrase at all, and simply brought it over into English, all of a sudden, even though the word does mean time, you will get another completely different look at what John was saying. And here is the same text, with the word simply carried over into English as is, without translating it. Do you notice anything different? Many, if not most, English-speaking people now immediately recognize what is in that sentence. And they completely understand the sentence even without translating that word. And they also see how that sentence would now make perfect sense. They understand how John would be saying there should be no more of this, but obviously there was. And all of a sudden, you will discover the meaning of the entire chapter is now affected by that untranslated word. And even what comes next in chapter 11. Why is that? That is because chronos, which did mean the word time in Greek, was not the only thing it meant. The Greek word time came from a Greco-Roman deity called Kronos. Kronos was attributed with time. So the name of the god was used as the word time in Greek. But here, if you translate the term chronos as simply the word time, you get a sentence that obviously makes no sense and doesn't work. But if you leave it untranslated, all of a sudden, it does. But there is much more evidence that the use of this term in chapter 10 verse 6 was using the word implying its original sense to refer to chronos, rather than just time. Because there are a number of echo texts in the surrounding 2 chapters that are immediately recognizable in reference to chronos, but not to time. And those surrounding echo texts would have made John's use of chronos in verse 6 much more apparent to his first century Greek-speaking audience, and clarify what John was actually prophesying about the 2 witnesses in chapter 11 as well, which according to John came in the year 1390 AD. In the chart on your screen is a list of all the main elements of the Chronos story. The Greek god Kronos was called Saturn in Latin, which you are going to see a lot more of in this text in a few minutes. Secondly, there was a prophecy to Kronos that he would be overthrown from his throne by his children. So, in an attempt to thwart this prophecy, he devoured his children. But the last child born, who was Zeus, was saved from being devoured by secrecy. His wife wrapped up a stone like a baby and gave it to Kronos to devour instead, and hid Zeus. Later, when Zeus grew up, he returned to Kronos and made him regurgitate his brothers, and conquered him, thus fulfilling the prophecy. As a result of defeating Kronos, he was given thunder as a reward. So these are the main elements of the Chronos story that you see on your screen. The main elements of the Chronos story you see on the top, and the main elements of Revelation chapter 10 you see under it. If you compare the main elements of the Chronos story to the main elements of Revelation chapter 10, you are going to see an amazing correlation. Out of 11 verses in chapter 10, 9 entire verses correlate to the Chronos story. That's over 80% of the entire text. 80%. Everything from devouring the book and then regurgitating it, to the mention of thunders, to the reference to Saturn, are present in chapter 10. And there was even more given in chapter 11, which we will get into once we are finished with chapter 10. But it is clear that not only does the immediate text in verse 6 suddenly make total logical sense, once Chronos is left untranslated, so do major elements of chapter 10 as a whole come alive and suddenly take on incredible sense and meaning, which is all lost when that word is hidden behind the English translation of it into the word time. Even though that is an accurate translation, this chapter is a prophecy against Chronos, not a prophecy against time, as you will fully see in a few minutes. But for now, you see that verse 6 is the word Chronos in Greek, and Chronos was the Greco-Roman deity of time, also known as Saturn, celebrated in the festival known as the Saturnalia in Rome. This festival was an important festival that remembered the mythical Golden Age of Rome, and was a key festival to the establishment and expansion of the Roman Empire. So you can see why counter-reformationists, whose main goal politically is working on the restoration of the Roman Empire, would have no desire to clarify that use of the Greek term, chronos, for their audiences. Next we will look at content that has been hidden in the 7 thunders. In Revelation chapter 10 verses 3 and 4, we come to a section of text that has been abused and distorted to mean just about anything. And once again, we come to the most common hermeneutic used by counter-reformation preachers when dealing with the book of Revelation, and that is ink blot-free association. But when John wrote these texts, he wasn't creating ink blots for people to practice free association with, thousands of years later. He was writing a prophecy. And as a prophecy, it contains an event, a location, and a time frame. And all 3 are referred to by John in Revelation 10. Like most of John's texts, here, he uses a combination of symbolism and literal references to create his prophecy. As a prophecy, John states some very obvious, literal things. In verse 1, he states he sees an angel clothed in a cloud. The word in Greek is nephele, and literally means cloudiness. Like on a cloudy day. Cloudiness is associated with rain and storms. He says the angel has a rainbow over his head. Rainbows are associated with storms. In the book of Genesis specifically, it was a sign given by God after Noah's flood. So rainbow is also a symbol of rain or a storm. And then we come to verses 3 and 4, and he says he hears thunder 7 times. And thunder is associated with storms. 7 thunders would be, simply put, a very large 7-day storm. There is no lightning mentioned in the text. But lightning causes thunder. When you hear thunder without lightning, it is because the lightning has occurred far away. So these events take place far away from John, geographically. He has just finished describing events which would take place on the far eastern side of the Roman Empire, against the Antichrist. But now in this text, John is looking to events which will take place on the far western side of the Roman Empire, once again, against the Antichrist. As you will see more clearly in the next section on the rainbow angel. But the most obvious thing about this text, that should be noted, is that he is prophesying the coming of a storm, of biblical proportions. A flood. When commentators get to verses 3 and 4, they get so fixated on the statement John makes about not writing down what he hears the thunders say, that they completely forget and then ignore the most obvious things about this text. They get all esoteric and mystical over the command to John not to write down what they say, and simply forget and ignore everything else in the text, as though it doesn't matter. They become completely obsessed over what John didn't write, when in reality, that is the least important thing in the entire text. The most obvious thing in the text is that John is describing a storm which will bring a flood, of biblical proportions, in the western part of the Roman Empire. And this obvious description gets completely ignored. Ignorance is a conjunction of 2 words. The word, ignore, and the suffix, ence. When you ignore the majority of the text, you end up with ignorance. So don't be ignorant when it comes to Revelation 10 verses 3 and 4. If you miss the rather obvious fact, he is prophesying a storm in verse 1 through 4, then you will definitely not get anything else right about Revelation 10. Now that we have acknowledged the most obvious thing about this text, let's dig into those things that seem complicated or mysterious. Because you cannot correctly interpret the sublime in a text if you don't even acknowledge the obvious first. Why is that? Because the sublime, mysterious or ambiguous things in the text all explain the obvious. That principle is called context. Meaning you interpret the meaning of things based on the context of the author. The context of verses 3 and 4 is that he is obviously describing a storm. So everything else in that section of text is related to that context. What about the storm? And John gives us a few more details about the storm in his symbolisms. He says the 7 thunders speak messages, but he is told not to write them out. Everyone who reads that statement can immediately see how illogical it is to mention the 7 thunders speak something to you, but you are told not to write it down. What's the point of mentioning it then? If you really wanted to keep something secret, you wouldn't tell everyone you had one. So John has written what appears to be a completely self-nullifying, nonsensical statement. Unless he has actually told you something about the storm that he has couched in these terms. One of the things you will recall about how to spot a time conversion text is that it is repetitive. It repeats the same value over and over. We certainly see that here. Another thing to notice, besides repetition, is that the values are often symbolical. 7 is the value repeated, so that is certainly symbolical. And the third thing to notice about time conversion texts is that the text itself seems grammatically odd. And we certainly have an odd text here, telling us he has heard something, but he isn't supposed to tell anyone what he heard. That would be very odd. So all 3 elements of a time conversion text are present in verses 3 and 4. And it would totally explain what John was doing in his odd statement. But what would the phrase, "not write it down," in reference to a time conversion text mean? As you saw in chapter 8, John uses both numeric and linguistic time conversions in his texts. When you learn math in school, you learn to solve 2 kinds of problems. One is the standard numeric problem where you are given a set of numeric values, and then you are told to perform some kind of math equation to solve the problem. The second kind of problem everyone learns to solve is called the word problem. There you are given a linguistic description of a set of values, and you must come up with the right values, and perform the right equation, required by the word problem. And you have seen John uses both techniques in calculating time frames for his texts. And here is where the command, not to write it out, becomes relevant. As you just saw in the previous text, a standard time conversion is done by summing all the values up in the text, and then multiplying them by the number of times they occur. If you sum all the values up in the text, and then you are told not to write it out, that simply means you stop with the sum value. You do not multiply the values out as normal. In order to multiply something, it was customary in the ancient world, just like it is today, to write it out, in order to multiply the values. That is how all people did multiplication, before calculators. And John says here, do not write it down. Stop with the sum. If we followed these instructions, we count up 4 uses of 7 in the text. 3 in verses 3 and 4, and once in verse 7 for a total of 28. And we stop with 28. John mentions 42 months after 130 AD in chapter 11 verse 2, and you saw previously how that produces the date of 1390 AD. The 7 thunders come before 1390 AD. So John has dated his prophecy concerning the 7 thunders, which is a storm of biblical proportions, to 28 years before 1390 AD. That gives us the date of 1362 AD. If we have done our homework correct, we should expect to find a flood of biblical proportions on the western side of the Roman Empire in the year of 1362 AD. So that explains John's odd language, telling us about a secret he's not supposed to tell us about. And if we have interpreted that correctly, we will find the event in history. If we haven't, it will become apparent when we begin to examine real history with our astronomically dated timeline. The third aspect of this text, however, still remains. We have identified the obvious, that it is a prophecy about a flood of biblical proportions. That John's odd expression in verse 4 is a time conversion instruction. But what about the voices he hears the thunders speak? Once again, if we just stay simplistic and obvious about the text, if John is describing voices giving speeches, then he is connecting 7 messages or 7 speakers to the storm. And these 7 voices are connected to the coming of the book that is in the angel's hand. The place of the storm brings forth these 7 voices. That is about as simple as you can get. So when we look at the time frame that John is giving us, we should also look to find 7 voices. What does that mean? We don't know yet, until we get there. But we do know there is a huge flood coming. It will occur in 1362 AD, and there will be 7 voices that will come from where this storm hits. That's very specific, and it is also very simple to the text. But John begins this chapter with a reference to an angel with a rainbow over his head. And this will begin John's astronomical dating for this period of history. So we will take a look at what John was talking about in his description of the rainbow angel next. Chapter 10 verse 1 reads as follows, in the KJV quote, "And I saw another mighty angel come down from heaven, clothed with a cloud, and a rainbow was upon his head, and his face was as it were the sun, and his feet as pillars of fire." End quote. As you have seen earlier, when John describes angels in heaven, doing things, John interpreted his use of this language in chapter 1 verse 20, as references to astronomical activity, which he tells his readers in verse 20, to keep in mind as they read his book. And so we see John is making another astronomical reference in chapter 10 verse 1 to begin this chapter. Once you understand how this language is to be understood, it is fairly easy to interpret its actual specific meaning. John refers to this angel as, quote, a mighty angel, end quote. That means nothing to modern audiences, but it was the title of a specific constellation, to Jews in the 1st century AD. Secondly, John says that he has a head and feet. That's a fairly important detail, because not all constellations are depicted as human constellations. Some are, but most aren't. John is discussing a constellation with a head and 2 feet. But in verse 2, John gives us an unmistakable detail about this constellation that there is simply no way it could either be a coincidence or accident. Quote, "And he had in his hand a little book open, And he set his right foot upon the sea, and his left foot on the earth. End quote. There were 48 named constellations in the ancient world. And John gets specific enough to eliminate all but one of them in his description, in verse 2. He says this constellation has a right foot on water, and a left foot on land. And he gets specific as to which one is under the right foot, and which one is under the left foot. And there is only one constellation in the entire sky out of those 48 constellations that match that description. It was called the Mighty One, it was depicted as a human, and it had its right foot on water, and its left foot on land. And that constellation is Orion. This prophecy is going to prove to be extremely disappointing to conspiracy theory fans of astrotheology, who regularly point to the 3 stars of Orion's belt and Christmas as proof Christianity was simply practicing astrotheology. Because here, John is going to bring up Orion specifically and connect it with one of the most gruesome judgments of God in human history. Not the promotion of Christmas, but quite the opposite. There is a reason John begins the 7th and last trumpet judgment with the constellation Orion. Orion was known throughout the ancient world as an important constellation in the solar deity cults of polytheism. He was known as the solstice constellation because he was found rising precisely on the eastern horizon, just before sunrise on every winter solstice. All kinds of star lore was associated with Orion throughout the world, in solar deity worship and cultures. Because his appearance on the eastern horizon marked the winter solstice, or the rebirth of the sun. And that is precisely why John begins the last and final trumpet judgment with Orion. As you saw in chapter 9, John's condemnation of the Byzantium Empire's worship of Apollo as Christ was made very clear in chapter 9. But if all that were not enough already, he is about to put the icing on the cake concerning Europe's continued embrace of sun worship in the form of its substitution of Apollo as Christ. With these prophecies concerning the coming of Orion. And we will get to what the prophecy actually is in a moment, right after we find out what John's time frame for these events actually are. And right now we are attempting to construct John's astronomical dating for this chapter. Now that we know he is referring to Orion, let's look at some of the other details that he points out to his readers. As mentioned, Orion was associated with the winter solstice because it appears on the eastern horizon, just before the winter solstice. But John says that he sees the Mighty One descending from heaven, meaning he is not seeing it on the eastern horizon as the custom with the solstice observances, but rather, he sees Orion descending, meaning he is seeing Orion on the western horizon, at sunset. When Orion is descending out of the sky, to the earth. And he mentions his face is as the sun, because he is seeing Orion at sunset on the horizon. This position of Orion at sunset is pointing directly to the western half of the Roman Empire, as mentioned earlier. He has just finished describing God's judgment on the eastern half of the empire, and now he is turning his attention to the western half, precisely as he has done in previous chapters. The second detail John mentions is that there is a rainbow above his head, like a crown, or an aura. Orion isn't depicted with a crown, so what is John referring to? Usually, John will give a constellation position with a planet, which in the ancient world were referred to as the 7 stars. Just as John states to his audience in the beginning of the book. The description of a rainbow, to modern audiences, would be pretty easy to identify as the planet Saturn. But the ancient world did not have telescopic lenses. So would they have known about Saturn's rings? And how would they have known this? Or could have John simply been using these references prophetically? Unknown to most modern people today, the ancients did in fact associate rings with Saturn. We are told that Saturn's rings were discovered by Christian Huygens using telescopes in 1655 AD. But when we look into history, we discover that the ancients already somehow associated rings with Saturn. No one knows how this association came to be. But they did have it somehow. One theory that has surfaced recently, reported in ScienceWire, June 29, 1999, came as a result of the discovery of what is now called the Nimrod lens. It is a 3,000-year-old optical lens, made from rock crystal, discovered at the Assyrian palace of Nimrod, in modern-day Iraq. The lens had a diameter of 1.5 inches and had a focal point of 12 centimeters, making it equivalent in strength to a magnification power of 3. And not only did they associate rings with Saturn, long before the telescope was invented in the modern era, they described these rings as made out of water, thus creating a rainbow effect when passing through sunlight. Today, with the aid of modern astronomy, we have learned that Saturn's rings are indeed, in large part, frozen ice crystals. Or in other words, composed of water. How the ancients knew this information, or how John would have known this information, is beyond the subject of this video, and not completely relevant, because we are after all, discussing prophecy, which is not known through natural knowledge, or rational analysis, but rather intuition, to begin with. But John's identification of Saturn, as the rainbow over Orion's head, is made more than clear, by his direct reference to Chronos, in verse 6. The Greek name for Saturn, which we will cover extensively in the next video. So the rainbow above Orion's head, was John's reference to the planet Saturn, moving into position over Orion. Saturn's circuit is 29.5 years long, which means it could have occurred 5.7 times between the last astronomical date of 1220 AD for the sixth trumpet, and 1390 AD beginning events in chapter 11. We already have 2 dates. 1390 AD for the beginning of chapter 11, and 1362 AD for a great storm flood, and this astronomical reference occurs just prior to 1362 AD. If we look into the sky, for the sign in the heavens, of Saturn over the head of Orion, we discover this occurred in 1355 AD. And ironically, 1355 AD is exactly 7 years before 1362 AD. And this marks the beginning of events in Revelation chapter 10. So we now have a complete astronomically dated time frame for Revelation chapter 10. Saturn moves into position over Orion in 1355 AD, signaling the coming of a great flood. In 1362 AD a great flood occurs in the western half of the Roman Empire. 7 voices are heard in history, heralding the coming of a book. And in 1390 AD the book comes and the events of chapter 11 begin, with the coming of the 2 witnesses in Jerusalem. And that concludes our topical study, and completes our astronomical dating for the events of Revelation chapter 10. You have seen the term, little book, was John's term for a book, and it was little in comparison to the larger format of scrolls, which had been used previously in history. You have seen the phrase, time no more, is a buried reference to the Greco-Roman god of time known as Chronos, who is also associated with the planet Saturn. And the winter solstice festival known as the Saturnalia, which historically was the precursor to our modern practice known as Christmas. You have seen that the 7 thunders refer to a 7-day storm, and also the personification of 7 voices, which herald the coming of a book. You have seen the rainbow angel is a reference to Saturn over Orion, which occurred in 1355 AD. And you have seen the astronomically dated time frame for chapter 10 spans from 1355 AD to 1390 AD. And culminates in 7 voices which change the course of history, prior to 1390 AD, and the Great Flood in 1362 AD, and the coming of a book in 1390 AD. In the next video, we will conclude chapter 10 by actually comparing what happened in history, with what John prophesied in Revelation chapter 10, to see if his prophecies were accurate, and how they were fulfilled, in history. You will be shocked and amazed, at not only what John was actually prophesying, but at how incredibly accurate and specific John's prophecies actually were. And how so much has been hidden from the public about these events by counter-reformationists, who have been committed to intentionally burying the known meaning of the book of Revelation for 500 years from the public. Thank you for watching.